I want to talk about something that most people don't really want to think about. And honestly, that's kind of the problem. We avoid the uncomfortable stuff until the uncomfortable stuff becomes unavoidable. And then we all look around and pretend we never saw it coming. So here's the thing, and I'll just say it bluntly. The money sitting in your bank account right now, it's not what you think it is. It looks alive. It acts alive, but if we're being honest, it's basically a patient on life support. And the people who run the system are just delaying the moment when they have to tell us the truth. Now, I'm not saying this to scare you. Fear isn't useful. What's useful is clarity. And the clearest way to look at this is by asking a very basic question. What would you do if you knew the biggest shift in wealth in human history was already in motion? Not starting someday, not maybe coming, but actually happening right now beneath your feet in slow motion. Would you keep doing the same things? Or would you rethink everything from first principles? Like actually break apart the assumptions and rebuild them from scratch. So let's start there, not with predictions, but with something simpler, a thought experiment that eventually becomes reality. You check your bank balance one morning, and the numbers look normal, maybe even a little higher. But here's the twist. The number means less than it did yesterday. And not in the typical slow inflation is bad way. I mean, in the sense that the currency you rely on has quietly stopped functioning as a true store of value. And the weird part is, everything looks fine on the surface. Your app works, your bank is open, the lights are on, but underneath the thing you thought was stable has entered a kind of mathematical freefall. People hear that and go, come on, that could never happen here. And I always wonder, why are we so sure? Because every empire that collapsed before us said the same thing right up until the moment it stopped being true. Rome, Weimar, Germany, Zimbabwe, Argentina, all of them followed the same pattern. People assume linearity, but history works in tipping points. Things stay stable, 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 then suddenly they aren't. So let's talk numbers for a minute. Not emotional numbers, not political numbers, just math. As of late 2025, the United States is sitting on a national debt that has blown past 38 trillion. And that's not a typo. That's not a rounding error. That's a number so massive you literally can't picture it. It's beyond the moon. Literally, if you tried stacking the bills and the direction isn't slowing down, it's actually accelerating like a rocket that passed the abort point 5 stages ago. And here's the part that's kind of insane when you think about it. The cost to service that debt, the interest, not the principal, has crossed the military budget. The United States is spending more money paying interest on old spending than it spends on defending itself. And once the interest payments become the biggest expense, you're in something economists call fiscal dominance, which is a fancy way of saying the machine is running the operators, not the other way around. The Federal Reserve completely boxed in. They can't raise interest rates enough to slay inflation because doing that would cause the interest payments to explode. It would basically bankrupt the government overnight. But they also can't keep rates low or go back to money printing without letting inflation run totally wild. So they're stuck in this paradox where every path leads to some kind of instability. And when a system reaches that point, the only remaining option historically is inflation, and not the predictable kind. The kind where the currency is sacrificed in slow motion to save the political system that relies on it. Since the 1970s, the dollar has already lost about 90% of its purchasing power. People forget that. They think inflation is some temporary wave. No, it's a slope, and it's been going down for 50 years. The line just gets steeper at certain moments. And we're approaching one of those moments now. Which brings us to the question that actually matters. What happens to real estate when the measuring stick, the dollar, collapses? Because most people treat real estate like it's immune from currency chaos. They say things like, people will always need homes. And sure, that's true. But the real question isn't whether people need homes, it's how the system values homes when the currency itself is melting. To understand that, you really have to look backward. Because all hyperinflations, all currency collapses, follow a surprisingly similar pattern, and one of the most interesting examples is Germany in the early 1920s. Hyperinflation didn't begin with chaos. It began with a government that couldn't pay its bills in hard currency. So it printed and printed and printed, and people went along with it because at first nothing felt wrong. The water starts lukewarm, that's always how it starts. But eventually the printing hits escape velocity. Prices double, triple, then double again in days. Workers run from the factory to the store at lunch just to spend their wages before they lose even more value by dinner. And meanwhile, there was this guy, Hugo Stinnes, who basically cracked the code of inflation while Everyone else saved cash or bought bonds. He did the opposite. He borrowed money, massive amounts of money. But here's the genius part. He borrowed in a currency he knew was dying. Then he used that dying currency to buy real, hard, productive assets, mines, factories, land, energy, real estate. Everyone thought he was crazy. Why are you taking on debt during a crisis? But he wasn't looking at the debt. He was looking at the value of the currency the debt was denominated in. When the mark collapsed, he repaid millions with pocket change, and the assets he bought, actual things the economy needed, kept their value. He didn't become rich by working harder. He became rich by understanding how inflation destroys debt, but preserves reality. And that lesson repeats across every collapsing currency. Zimbabwe, Argentina, Russia, different cultures, different governments, same mechanics, cash dies, hard assets survive. But that doesn't mean everyone wins. Most people don't. Most people cling to cash because it feels safe until it isn't. So the real question is not, will the dollar collapse tomorrow? That's not how these systems behave. They rot first. They wobble. They send warning signals for years. And the collapse happens after people ignore those signals for too long. The real question is, where are we in that timeline? From everything we're seeing, we're somewhere in the latest stage cycle, the phase where the system pretends everything is fine while quietly rearranging the furniture for the next act. You get these stages. The first is complacency. Inflation rises, people complain, but everyone adapts. It's like, yeah, milk costs more, gas costs more, but life goes on. The system relies on this. It relies on people tolerating small pain. The next phase is something much more dangerous, a confidence crisis. Foreign holders of U.S. debt, countries like China and Japan, start pulling back. They realize the math doesn't add up. They don't roll over their bonds. They sell. The dollar starts slipping. Imports get more expensive. Inflation feeds inflation. And suddenly the world isn't sure the dollar is the safest place to park its wealth anymore. Then comes the liquidity squeeze. This is where banks stop lending because they're worried the money they get paid back with will be worth less. Mortgages disappear. ATMs limit withdrawals. People feel the system tightening around them. And it gets real, really fast. After that comes the flight to hard assets. Everyone rushes to buy the things that can't be printed. Land, metals, Bitcoin, energy, and then the final stage, the part nobody wants to talk about, the social unraveling. Because when wages don't keep up with prices, society stress, they break at the edges first. Strikes, protests, people fighting over shrinking slices of the pie, and eventually the currency has to be reset. It's always reset. Old units get scrapped, new units get introduced, sometimes backed by something real, sometimes just backed by force. But through all these phases, real estate undergoes this almost paradoxical journey. In dollar terms, prices could explode higher. Homes that cost a few $100,000 could cost millions or tens of millions. And people think, wow, the market is booming. No, the currency is dying. The number going up isn't the asset rising. It's the measuring stick shrinking. But here's the twist. Even while nominal prices explode, affordability collapses, mortgages vanish, builders can't operate because their inputs change price too fast. Supply slows, demand fractures, and the people who come out ahead are the ones who already own property with fixed debt. The Hugo Stinn strategy, but applied to everyday homeowners. If you owe $300,000 on your house in a hyperinflationary world, and your wages adjust upward but your mortgage stays fixed, you win. You repay in weaker dollars. The bank takes the hit. The currency takes the hit. You end up owning the asset free and clear for what becomes pocket change. Meanwhile, savers, people who did everything right, get destroyed. Renters get squeezed. Variable rate borrowers get crushed. Banks collapse. And the government, it intervenes hard. Rent controls, price controls, capital controls, digital currencies, surveillance layers, whatever. They think will keep the system intact. But I'll pause here because this is already a lot, and it's only the beginning. The bigger question is, why is all of this accelerating now? What's the glob? Catalyst? And how do you not just survive it, but position yourself on the right side of the transition? So let's pick up from the point where everything starts accelerating, because that's the part most people miss. The collapse of a currency isn't just a domestic event. It's not something that happens because one country makes a mistake. It's usually triggered by the global environment shifting in a way that exposes internal weaknesses. And right now, we're watching that shift unfold in real time. It's subtle, it's slow, but it's unmistakable if you're paying attention. For decades, the United States benefited from something almost absurdly powerful. The world needed dollars to function. Not just like them, not just preferred them, needed them. Global trade, especially energy trade, basically required dollars. If a country wanted oil, it needed dollars. If it wanted to buy raw materials, it needed dollars. That meant there was this constant worldwide demand for the currency. And when the demand for your currency is infinite, you can get away with things no one else can. You can print more, you can borrow more, you can inflate the supply without destroying trust. It's like being the casino instead of the gambler. But here's the part people rarely think through. What happens when the world suddenly doesn't need your currency anymore? What happens when every country quietly starts saying, maybe we should rethink this arrangement? That's exactly what's happening right now. Not loudly, not with speeches, but with actions. And actions tell the real story. You have central banks around the world buying gold at the fastest pace since the late 1960s. You have major economies making trade agreements outside of the dollar system. You have nations building their own payment rails to bypass the traditional financial architecture. And none of this is being done casually. It being done because the United States sent a message, intentionally or not, when it froze Russia's sovereign reserves in 2022. That move essentially said to every country on the planet, your dollar holdings are only yours as long as we approve. And when you say that out loud, even indirectly, other nations start asking questions. First principles questions, the kind I actually respect. If your reserves can be frozen, are they really reserves? If your assets can be confiscated, are they really assets? If your wealth depends on political alignment, is it really wealth? These questions are echoing through capitals worldwide, and the response has been predictable: diversify away from the dollar. Not abandon it entirely, not yet, but reduce reliance, build alternatives, create optionality. And when you have dozens of countries doing this at once, it weakens the foundation of the currency in ways that aren't obvious day to day, but become catastrophic over longer horizons. Now, here's where the chain reaction begins. There are trillions, literally trillions, of US dollars circulating outside the United States. Dollars held in foreign reserves. Dollars held in offshore accounts. Dollars used in trade between countries that have nothing to do with America. These are the euro dollars, the offshore dollars. And for decades, they've been sitting out there, orbiting the global economy like satellites. But if the world stops wanting to hold dollars, those trillions start making their way home. They come back to the US because the global economy no longer absorbs them. And when that happens, you get what I call a boomerang effect. The dollars you once exported because the world demanded them return all at once. And when they come back, they flood the domestic economy, too many dollars chasing too few goods, and the Federal Reserve can't stop it because the supply is external, not inte. This is the moment where inflation turns into something else entirely. Not just rising prices, but a rapid reevaluation of the currency. And it forces the government into a corner where they need a new system. But instead of picking a system that restores decentralization or strengthens freedom, they pick the opposite. They pick control because that's the path governments always choose in times of crisis. Which brings us to central bank digital currencies. This part is deeply misunderstood. People think a digital dollar is just a convenient upgrade. They imagine it like Apple Pay but official. But that's not what it is at all. A CBDC isn't a digital version of cash. It's an entirely different species of money. It's programmable, trackable, expandable, or deletable at will. And that's where the danger lies. Think about what happens when money can be programmed. The issuer, meaning the government, can decide how it's used. They can restrict purchases, they can limit transfers, they can set expiration dates to encourage spending, they can block transactions they don't like, they can require compliance with certain behaviors, they can tie your money to your identity and your reputation, and all of this can be automated. If you think that's abstract, it isn't. This technology already exists. Other countries are already deploying it, and governments, once they get access to this level of control, do not give it back. The temptation is too strong. So why does this matter for real estate? Because as the world moves toward digitized programmable money, physical assets become the final frontier of autonomy. Real estate becomes a kind of firewall, a buffer, something that exists outside the software layer of money. You can't freeze a house with a keyboard. You can't throttle someone's acreage with an algorithm. You can't delete a building because someone's social score dipped. Now, obviously, governments can still seize property in extreme cases, but it's messy, it's complicated, it's physical, the barrier is higher, and when systems get strained, people flock to assets that resist centralized control. That's why land matters more in the future, not less. But let's tie this back to the collapse mechanics, because this isn't just about philosophy or autonomy. There's a practical consequence here. When real estate becomes the last refuge, demand doesn't fall, it actually rises, not in a speculative bubble way, but in a survival of value way. People start trading whatever they have that's still liquid, cash, crypto, metals, to acquire something fixed, something tangible, something with a roof or soil or utility, and that shift creates a reallocation of wealth faster than anything we've seen in modern times. This is the heart of the wealth transfer. When the currency collapses, slowly then quickly, the people who hold assets stay anchored while everyone else gets uprooted. And it's not about being rich or poor, it's about being positioned or unpositioned. Someone with a modest home and a fixed mortgage can actually outperform someone with millions in savings. That's how dramatic the inversion is. But here's the catch, and this part is important. You only benefit from inflation-induced debt destruction if you can hold on to the asset long enough. Because during the volatility, cash flow becomes more important than net worth. If you lose your job in the turmoil, if you can't make the payments, if your reserves run out, the bank takes the asset back long before inflation saves you. That's why liquidity is not optional, it's essential. And here's another twist. The government doesn't just sit back and watch any of this happen. They intervene, sometimes in subtle ways, sometimes in ways that break the entire market. Rent controls are one example. Hey, sound compassionate, but in practice, when landlords' costs rise, but their rents are frozen, properties get abandoned, maintenance collapses, housing supply shrinks, cities decay, price controls come next. They create shortages because you can't force producers to supply goods at a loss. Capitals follow, transfers get limited, conversions get restricted. People get stuck inside the system, unable to exit. And then at the end of the cycle, a currency reset is introduced, a new unit, a new design, a new promise, sometimes backed by assets, sometimes backed by nothing, but the hope that people will accept it. In Germany, after hyperinflation, they introduced the rent mark, backed not by gold, but by land and industrial output. In future scenarios, the United States might back a new currency with gold or energy reserves or federal land or a commodity basket. But here's the interesting part. During resets, governments often impose windfall taxes. They look at the people who survived the collapse, especially homeowners who paid off debt with weak currency, and they tax the perceived benefit. They call it fairness, but what it really is that a way to rebuild the system on the backs of the people who prepared. And this brings us back to the idea of positioning. Because even with interventions, even with controls, even with resets, the people who understand the mechanics ahead of time still come out ahead. Not because they're lucky, but because they align themselves with reality instead of denying it. They treated value as value instead of treating currency as value. They didn't confuse the measuring stick with the thing being measured. So what does positioning actually look like? Well, debt management is one part. Getting fixed rate debt is crucial. Using good debt to acquire real assets is crucial. Avoiding variable rate traps is crucial. Eliminating consumer debt is crucial. And you also need hard assets outside the real estate category because overexposure is risky. Gold, silver, Bitcoin, things that live outside the traditional system. But there's another layer that people underestimate. Human capital and community. In every collapse, the people who thrive aren't just asset-rich. They're skill-rich, they're network-rich, they have competence. They have relationships. They have the ability to adapt. And that's something inflation can't destroy. So the bigger perspective here is that we're entering a transition point. Not the end of the world, not the end of society, but the end of a particular system, a fiat cycle, a financial architecture that has reached its mathematical ceiling. And when that system resets, everything tied to it gets repriced. Homes, debt, labor, wealth, status, all of it. The only question that matters is, do you want to be on the side that gets repriced or the side that does the repricing? Everybody thinks they're ready for, but very few actually are, because talking about the collapse of a currency is easy. It's dramatic, it's intense, it's cinematic in a way. But the thing that actually matters is the transition. What do you do before the storm? What do you do during it? What do you do after it? These three phases determine whether you end up on the losing side of history or on the side that's positioned to rebuild. Most people wait for signs. They want confirmation. They want the news to tell them the collapse has begun. But the news doesn't do that until it's already too late. Systems don't announce their own failures. They drift into them quietly, almost politely at first. And by the time the average person recognizes what's happening, the strategic window is already closed. So one of the first things you have to do is stop thinking in terms of dollars. And I know that sounds weird because dollars are the UN, of measurement the entire culture uses. But that's the trap. The unit is broken. The measuring stick is bent. when the instrument is corrupted, the data becomes meaningless. So thinking in terms of dollars during a currency collapse is like trying to measure rising water with a ruler that's dissolving in your hands. You need a new frame. The frame you need is purchasing power. Not the number of dollars you have, but what those dollars can command in the real world. $1 million doesn't matter if it buys you what 50,000 used to buy. And this mindset shift, this recalibration toward value instead of currency, is the foundation of survival in a transition like the one we're heading toward. And yes, real estate plays a huge role in this, but only certain kinds and only under specific conditions. This is where people mess up. They assume real estate is always safe. It isn't. Depends on the type, the location, the debt structure, the cash flow profile, and the political landscape. It depends on whether the property is a liability or an anchor. So let's break down what actually matters. The first thing you need to understand is debt, not as a burden, but as a tool. In high inflation environments, fixed rate debt becomes one of the most powerful wealth multipliers available to ordinary people. You borrow in strong dollars and repay in weak dollars. That's not speculation, that's arithmetic. But here's the twist. This only works if the debt is fixed, not adjustable, not floating, not hybrid, fixed. Variable rate debt turns into a guillotine. When inflation heats up, interest rates spike. That's not optional. It's the only mechanism the system has to slow the bleeding. And when rates spike, people with adjustable debt get crushed. Their payments double, triple, sometimes more, and they're forced to sell the asset in a panic long before inflation has time to erode the PR. Insightful. That's why fixed-rate mortgages are not just useful, they're essential. But debt alone isn't the strategy. The asset matters, and not all real estate is equal when a currency is falling apart. Luxury markets collapse first. They rely on speculation, low interest rates, abundant credit, and stock market wealth. When financial systems break, those markets freeze. Nobody buys a $10 million penthouse in the middle of a monetary contraction. Those assets become illiquid trophies, not stores of value. What actually survives are assets tied to fundamentals, housing the average person, shelter people can afford even during income volatility, properties located in regions with net migration inflows, job stability, and economic resilience. The places people move to when life gets hard, not the places they leave. If you want stability, you need exposure to where the population is heading, not where it used to be. And then there's farmland. Honestly, in any period of systemic stress, farmland becomes almost primal in its importance. It produces food, and food is the one thing whose demand never falls to zero. You can delay a car purchase, you can skip a vacation, but you can't skip calories. So farmland becomes this almost underrated core asset that generates value regardless of the currency used to measure it. It's a form of wealth older than banking systems themselves, and currency collapse doesn't diminish it, it actually highlights it. But as important as real estate is, you still need more than one pillar. Because no empire collapse, no currency reset, no monetary transformation in history has been neat or clean. They're messy, chaotic, political. You need diversification across objects that exist outside the banking system: gold, silver, Bitcoin. These aren't speculative plays in this context. They're circuit breakers. They're bridges across chaos. Gold and silver, yeah, they're old school, but they've been money for thousands of years. They're trusted because they're scarce, physical, and free of counterparty risk. They don't rely on someone else's promise. Bitcoin is different, but it's built on the same principles: scarcity, decentralization, resistance to debasement. It's essentially digital property, immune to the printing press, immune to centralized manipulation. People who don't understand think it's speculative. But a lot of things look speculative until the old system begins to fail. Then they become lifeboats. However, and I really want to emphasize this, hard assets alone are not enough. You also need liquidity. Currency collapses don't happen in a straight line. They whip, they jolt, they create temporary deflationary shocks, even inside inflationary periods. And during those shocks, cash becomes king. Not long-term, but short-term. Cash gives you breathing room, it gives you runway, it gives you the ability to avoid forced selling. And forced selling is what destroys people in these times, not the collapse itself. If you have to sell your house to cover groceries, you lose. If you have to sell your gold to pay rent, you lose. If you have to liquidate Bitcoin at the bottom to cover a surprise expense, you lose. Liquidity prevents that. It buys you time. It lets your long-term strategy mature. So keeping 6 to 12 months of expenses accessible is not optional. It's a buffer between you and panic. Now, all of this is the mechanical side of the strategy. But there's another dimension that's just as important, maybe more important, and that's social capital and skills. Every collapse in history shows the same pattern. The people who come out ahead aren't just the people with assets. They're the people with competency. They're the people who can provide value regardless of what the currency is doing. If you can build, fix, create, repair, produce, or manage, you're valuable. If you can lead, coordinate, and think clearly under stress, you're valuable. If you can adapt quickly to new incentives, you're valuable. Skills become a kind of internal currency, one that no inflation can erode. And communities matter the same way. Isolation is vulnerability. Strong community is resilience. In times of economic strain, people rely on each other not because it's idealistic, but because it's practical. Collaboration becomes survival. Now, we also have to talk about government behavior during these periods because it won't be passive, it won't be hands-off, it will be interventionist. And sometimes those interventions become the biggest risk of all. Rent control is one example. It sounds compassionate, but when landlords can't raise rents to match their rising costs, properties degrade, maintenance collapses, supply drops, and the housing market fractures. Price controls on essential goods. Same outcome, shortages, black markets, inferior quality. Capital controls, those trap people's money inside failing systems, preventing them from escaping. And digital currencies allow all of this to be enforced instantly. Not with police, not with courts, with code. And then there's taxation. When the reset comes, governments look for who benefited. They see the people who paid off long-term debt with inflated currency and they consider that a windfall. And historically, they tax windfalls. They call it fairness. But it's really a way to recapitalize the new system. So the people who prepared have to prepare for that too. They need to build defensively, not just opportunistically. They need to plan for political risk, not just financial risk. Because the collapse of a currency isn't just an economic event, it's a political one. And political behavior becomes extreme when systems break. But despite that, despite all the volatility, all the chaos, all the intervention, the real opportunities are enormous. Because these transitions are not just destructive, they're transformative. They reorganize the entire hierarchy of society. They reset who holds power. They reset who holds assets. They reset who gets to rebuild the next system. And this brings us to the idea I call knowledge currency, not in a poetic sense. In a literal sense, when a currency collapses, everything that depends on it becomes unstable. But knowledge, real grounded strategic knowledge, doesn't devalue. It becomes more valuable. And the people who understand the mechanics before everyone else gets blindsided are the ones who build the next era. Most people assume collapse means the end. But collapse is just a clearing mechanism. It's the end of a system that stopped working. And real estate, because it's physical, because it's rooted in reality, because it has utility, survives the clearing. The land remains. The structures remain. What changes is who owns them and what the new currency system looks like. And that's why preparation isn't optional. It's necessary. The debt is too large. The math is too unforgiving. The transition isn't coming someday. It's happening now. So the question isn't whether the dollar survives. The question is whether you survive the dollar's transformation. And the way to do that is straightforward. Own assets. Use fixed debt intelligently. Hold liquidity. Diversify into real stores of value. Build skills. Strengthen community. And adopt first principles thinking. The old system rewards denial. The new system rewards clarity, but clarity requires courage. Courage to question assumptions, courage to take uncomfortable actions, courage to think independently, even when society clings to comforting illusions. And that brings us to the final element of this entire framework, the PAR, T that ties everything together. Because if you understand how currencies die, how wealth transfers, how real estate behaves, how governments respond, and how individuals can navigate the transition, then the last piece is obvious. And that piece is the mindset you bring into the transition. So now we need to talk about the part people underestimate the most, the mindset that carries you through the transition. Not the thing you buy, not the thing you own, not the number on a spreadsheet, your mindset. Because when a system reaches the edge of sustainability, everything it taught you becomes outdated. And that includes the mental scripts you grew up with. The entire operating logic changes. And if your thinking doesn't update along with it, you end up following rules that no longer apply. The traditional system told you to save cash, avoid debt, trust institutions, rely on predictable cycles, and assume stability as the default state of the world. But those rules only work when the currency is stable, when the debt is manageable, when the institutions are healthy, and when the cycles are self-correcting. Once those conditions disappear, the old rules don't just stop working, they become dangerous. And this is the part where human psychology becomes the biggest risk factor. Most people cling to what feels comfortable, even when what feels comfortable is actively harming them. They cling to cash because it feels safe, even as the purchasing power melts away. They cling to traditional investments because they've been told they're low risk, even when the math proves otherwise. They cling to the idea that everything will return to normal, even when every signal is pointing in the opposite direction. This attachment to normally is one of the most destructive forces during a collapse. Not the inflation itself, not the currency reset, not the debt burden, the denial. People see the signs, but they don't act because acting feels like admitting something uncomfortable, and humans avoid discomfort at almost any cost. But thinking from first principles forces you out of this cycle. It forces you to strip the system down to its fundamentals. What is value? What is money? What is risk? What is ownership? What is freedom? What is leverage? These are basic questions, but the answers change depending on the health of the system. In a stable system, money is a tool. In an unstable system, money becomes a trap. In a stable system, debt is a liability. In an inflationary collapse, fixed debt becomes an asset. In a stable system, institutions provide trust. In a failing system, trust has to be rebuilt individually. So adopting a first principles mindset means refusing to think in terms of what people normally do. Instead, you think what actually works under the emerging conditions, what survives, what fails, what transfers, what collapses, what transforms. If you do that, you begin to see opportunities most people never notice. You see how inflation destroys savings, but destroys debt even faster. You see how real estate bridges the gap between old money and new money. You see how skills become currency when money stops functioning. You see how community becomes infrastructure when institutions break. You see how digital currencies can become tools of control rather than tools of freedom. And you see how autonomy suddenly becomes the most valuable asset of all. And this leads to the deeper truth here. The collapse of a currency is never just financial. It's cultural, it's psychological, it's moral, it's technological, it's geopolitical, it's structural. It's everything at once because money is woven into every part of society. When money breaks, everything attached to it starts breaking in slow motion. But something else happens at the same time. Innovation accelerates, not because collapse is good, but because collapse clears out the baggage that was preventing innovation in the first place. And when the old system loses its grip, space opens up for new systems, new technologies, new institutions, and new models of value. It's chaotic, yes, but it's also a reset button for creativity. Think about technological disruptions in the past. The horse industry collapsed, but transportation exploded. The rotary phone industry collapsed, but global communication exploded. The systems that die make room for systems that never could have existed otherwise. Now apply that to money. When fiat systems break, something else replaces them. Historically, it's been gold-backed currency. But the world is different now. Technology is different. The tools are different. The level of global connectivity is different. So whatever the next system looks like, it will be built on a completely new technological foundation. And this is where some people misunderstand my perspective. They think I'm pessimistic about the future. I'm not at all. I'm pessimistic about systems that refuse to update themselves. But the future itself, the future is always optimistic for people who think clearly and adapt quickly. Collapse isn't the end of progress. It's the removal of constraints. It's the beginning of reinvention. But that optimism is only useful if you're prepared. Because when the transition hits, you don't want to be scrambling. You don't want to be fighting for basic necessities. You don't want to be locked out of opportunities because you're too busy surviving. You want to be positioned calm, liquid, and clear-minded enough to act when everyone else is panicking. And that's why your base, your foundation needs to be strong before the volatility arrives. You need assets that hold real value. You need debt that becomes lighter over time. Why? Oh, you need liquidity that gives you breathing room. You need skills that give you leverage. You need community that gives you resilience. And you need a mindset that sees through narratives instead of getting trapped by them. Now, here's something important that most people overlook. When systems break, the people who suffer the most are the ones who rely entirely on the system. If your wealth exists fully inside the banking architecture, you're exposed. If your identity depends on institutional validation, you're exposed. If your security depends on government stability, you're exposed. If your worldview depends on predictable cycles, you're exposed. But if you own land, own skills, own tools, own relationships, own independent assets, own your mindset, then you're insulated. You're not immune, but you're insulated. And insulation is what buys you the ability to make strategic decisions instead of emotional ones. And here's the thing, most people never consider during these periods, the people who rebuild tend to be the ones who weren't paralyzed by the old system's collapse. They had enough autonomy to operate outside the chaos. They had enough clarity to see opportunity where others saw only danger. They had enough courage to step into uncertainty while others retreated into fear. This isn't about being fearless. Fear is normal. Fear is data, but the goal is to avoid being dominated by fear. The goal is to be rational when others are reactive. The goal is to think long-term when others are thinking hour by hour. And you can only do that if you prepare intellectually before you prepare financially. And this brings us full circle because everything we've talked about, currency decay, debt destruction, real estate dynamics, geopolitical catalysts, digital control grids, asset allocation, liquidity, human capital, it all comes back to one central idea. The world is entering a transition phase, and your job is to navigate it consciously, not accidentally. If you're awake when others are sleepwalking, you get to move before the crowd. If you think independently when others rely on outdated assumptions, you avoid the traps. If you stabilize your base when others assume stability will always exist, you gain an advantage few people ever experience. And let me say this clearly. The debt number 38 trillion and climbing isn't just a statistic. It's a gravitational force. It's pulling the system toward a point of transformation whether anyone likes it or not. And pretending this isn't happening won't stop it. Complaining won't stop it. Hoping won't stop it. Only preparation changes your trajectory. So the final choice becomes incredibly simple. You either live inside the collapse or you live above it. You either let the system decide your fate or you build your own position before the system resets. You either cling to the old world as it dissolves, or you step into the new world as it emerges. Most people wait for certainty, but certainty is the last phase of any cycle. By the time something becomes obvious, it's already too late to act. So you don't prepare for collapse when collapse arrives, you prepare for it when the signals start appearing. And those signals are everywhere. Now, this isn't about doom, it's about awareness. It's about strategic clarity. It's about refusing to be a passenger in a vehicle you can clearly see losing control. It's about choosing to be the engineer instead of the passenger. And every transformation in history starts with a single question, a question that breaks the spell of complacency, a question that forces a person to think independently for the first time. So the question I want to leave you with is simple, but not easy. If the currency you trust today stopped being trustworthy tomorrow, would your current STR adage still make sense? Or would you suddenly realize you are preparing for a world that no longer exists?